All right, gang. Have 6 o'clock. I hate to break up this fun fellowship we're having, but we'll try to get this thing started and see if we can get through this business tonight. Call the meeting Budget and Finance Committee to order. This is a kind of a not a regular monthly meeting, so the things that we have to try to deal with tonight, number one is the implementation of the compensation study. I'd actually like for us to take that up first, since that's a long ongoing old business, I guess you would say. And then the Sheriff Department request, we can get into that a little bit later once we dispose of this other. Bear in mind that we're not deciding this tonight, whether to do it or not. We're just deciding whether to send it on to the full body with a, favorable recommendation or not. And so I don't want anybody to think that whatever we decide tonight is what's necessarily going to be, because that probably don't need to say that, but we're all pretty old and experienced here. But just for certainly anyone that's listening that's not real clear with our procedures, just wanted to make that kind of clear. I guess we'll start with the compensation study implementation. I think the biggest thing that two things that we probably, number one, need to decide is whether we want to do this or not. And if we so choose, when we would want to start this. We got kind of sidetracked meetings before with a percentage of increase or automatic increase or whatnot. And the language that we've put into this would say that that would be subject to that year's appropriations. So it would only be whatever that year's commission decides for those increases to be, as far as the adjustment every year. So what we're looking at, and if I'm wrong in this, Amy, Stephen, Brandon, please tell me, is whether we're going to have these levels, these steps in place, these categories, I guess you'd say, that puts a particular job classification into a certain step or classification as far as their job duties, and then how they would be able to, so to speak, move up the ladder as time goes on. That's an oversimplified thing. I hope y'all have had plenty of time to look at it and get your questions answered. But Mayor, I would welcome you to jump into this, and if you think there's other things that I didn't articulate very well, please let us know.
No, I think that pretty much summarizes kind of what the issue is in front of the committee. And obviously, Amy and I are willing to answer any further questions you may have. I know we've had a lot of discussion on it already, but if there's anything else you think we can answer, we try to do our best to get those answers for you.
Committee questions? Mr. Buckmaster, you recognize.
Mr. Chair, I sort of like simple. And I don't believe I'm capable of figuring what every employee's worth here per hour. I would like to say that in general, the compensation study is outdated already, in my opinion, but I also believe it gives us something to go by. Since I do like simple and I don't think I can tell everybody what people are worth, I would propose we let the department heads use that study and propose a reasonable wage for the employees in their budget for the upcoming year and make it fit within the budget.
I think I understand your thinking, and I 100% agree with you. And I think that's what the intentions of trying to look at those increases would need to be. We know that we're in unsettled times, particularly when it comes to payroll and employees. And yes, the information is somewhat dated as far as the dollar amounts, but as far as the classifications of the employees, I think that's just as valid now as it was a year ago. So I think we could absolutely adopt this plan or this way of approaching payroll and employees. And as far as the dollar amounts, we can adjust them going into the next budget season, which we're starting right away. The only thing that we're going to need some guidance at some point as to what we think those figures need to be, what those increases may need to be able to put the budget together. I'm saying you know, you got to have one to do the other. And with that right upon us, it's not like we're kicking this can down the road 6 months. This is something that we're going to be dealing with in April and May, trying to put the budget figures together. So, very good point. Appreciate you saying that. Any other thoughts, questions? Mr. Gully, you're recognized.
Yes, Mr. Jewell. If I'm not mistaken, our personnel committee spent quite a bit of time going through this wage study. Another aspect of this wage study was classification job descriptions for each job. Is that correct? I think Mr. Ferguson is the chair of that. Is that correct?
Yes, I am, and you're correct. Yes, what it does is it creates classifications or relabels some of the jobs, and then it also ranks based upon the ability levels of different people and the years of service and things of that nature. It creates a structure, if you will, which is, you know, you can separate the structure if you wanted to from the dollar amount temporarily and say, I like the structure, because it gives us also the ability to maneuver during good times and hard times both. The structure doesn't mandate that you have to do anything, but at least it puts it in a way that you have step raises that everybody understands you get to a certain level. But it does, some departments, from what we understood, needed different titles to make it all fit. I think the water department probably was more structured, there's more arrangements made there than any other department, because they were lacking some of the different descriptors, if you will, of the different job positions that they held. But so others had some adjustments, but yes. And so to echo what Commissioner Buckmaster said, what Mr. Buckmaster indicated was that, you know, we can tackle the amount of money separately than the structure itself. And so he's assuming that the structure would go, which I have to say that, you know, we spend a lot of time on. I agree. The structure is, to me, sound.
Mr. Clarity, you recognize?
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Beller, he said maybe a month, perhaps 2 months ago, that we do this in steps. He recommended that. I'd like to ask him to be more, tell us how he thinks we ought to do it or whatever.
Mr. Clarity, you're gonna have to refresh my memory. You're talking about asking me to remember something a month ago. A week ago was tough enough. I do remember vaguely a little bit about that, but I said that was an option that you could, if you took it on in steps. There were some discussions that were made. Somebody asked my input, and I don't know if it was you or Mr. Gully one, or but that is an option. So I don't have a recommendation on that. As far as the
this discussion right here goes, this is something that's, I think there's been a lot of dialogue and by folks that are a lot more intelligent than I am as far as what they've put forth. Now, I go back to Mr. Thompson's. Mr. Thompson's study was for the purpose of what he put forth, and I think at some point that structure was the one that we had initially started out with, and I think that'd gone from my recollection of the Personnel Policy Committee, and I see Mr. Ferguson's nodding his head that was what that was what was going to be kind of put forth from that standpoint. Now, I hope that answers your question, but I don't have I know there's no easy answers for this body in that. I agree with you, but my point in raising that, I know, knowing my habits, is you got to start somewhere. And if you had to go in increments, take it in increments or steps, if you will, or set up the entire structure as proposed by Mr. Those are some of the options you have. I'm sure there are others.
Mr. Gully.
To finish up on my question I asked there a minute ago on some pieces, did the Personnel Committee provide any changes, clarifications, aspects that they were looking at that they wanted to keep from this structure, that they wanted to remove from this structure? I know there was quite a bit of discussion of on the structure of this piece. When we're talking about the structure, are we talking about the exact structure that was proposed by Mr. Thompson's study, or are we talking about the structure that came out of Personnel Committee?
If you would like for me to try to work through that, yes, the Personnel Committee, as we looked at that, looked at from a perspective of, is the structure, how does the structure change the different departments and what does it do for them? I know one component of the structure gives evaluations, and I know Mr. Gregory and I have talked about this for many years, that we needed a mechanism to do that, and I think this does that. One thing I'd like to point out, that we didn't really change any of the structure. We had questions about different departments. Why did one have more moving parts and more additions than maybe some of the others? But at the end of the day, the Personnel Committee itself decided that the structure as it was presented was solid. Now, to me, there's two separate conversations we need to have. The first conversation we need to have is the structure acceptable by this body to move it forward? If you want to separate that conversation from the dollar amount that was also a recommendation, we can do that. And Mr. Buckmaster is somewhat alluding to that when he says, you know, maybe we're at a point now that the figures that we were given 6 months ago in today's moving and volatile market, you know, can change. I don't know. But I think that my recommendation, being the chairman of the Personnel Committee, and what we looked at, is that maybe what we should do tonight is to have the conversation only on the structure first and see if we can come to a consensus on that to move that forward. And then we can have a second conversation about the dollar figure that's tied, or the recommendation of the dollar figure that was tied to it.
That answer your question?
It's getting me to where I was wanting to get going. So as we get moving along with that piece, when we're talking about the structure, was there any discussion inside this structure which has a 2% about cost of living adjustment per year expected in it? It asks for roughly an X amount of percentage expected over 16 steps is what I'm saying there in this case. And the reason I say that part, 2 years ago in our budget, we gave roughly a 2% cost of living adjustment, cost our county about 120 grand. It's about what it costs to move it up 2%. 120 grand is pretty easy to multiply over 16 steps each time that comes available. So what I'm saying, so inside that structure, I believe there's also a 2% raise set or a 2% cost of living adjustment that each department head would get to say, hey, you're making the next step, you're making the next step. Let's just be honest. It's tough for people to have a conversation with people they work with every day and say, I'm sorry, you hadn't met the recommendation that we need you to meet to move that next step. So more than likely, we'd be looking at 16 steps in 16 years of an employee, which I am for our employees, but I don't think our county can continue to have a 2% raise year over year over year over year. Cost around 120 each time. Then you're going to take that 120, multiply it on your 2%. If people understand compound interest, that's going to work that way as well. So the reason I was getting into that structure side of things is I want to look at this at the side that I talked about in the beginning there. One of those is the mayor asked in the beginning of this wage study, one of the major points he had pushed on it was that there would be job descriptions, real true descriptions and descriptors. I think that's something we ought to look at first before we talk about just the structure as a whole.
Well, I believe that personnel did look at the job descriptions within the matrix that was proposed. Those job descriptions basically were provided by each department head and in conjunction with Mr. Thompson in the mayor's office as far as what the job duties are and what they are typically called, and trying to classify between departments so each department didn't have their own, that they meshed between departments. And I think that, you know, we looked at, you know, is this too many? Does it need to be more? And seemed to think that this was more than adequate to cover all the departments now and any growth and normal things into the future. So I think that was why it was decided on those 16 levels of job descriptions, I guess you would say. And I think that was also taken from customary practices on what they've dealt with in other similar situations. You know, I'm comfortable with those job classifications. There, you know, everything we do, at some point in time, it's going to have to be tweaked. We know that. There may be, you know, 2-3 years from now when we've grown exponentially, we may have to add levels to it. We may see that one of these levels, we've went 5 years and never had anybody in it, and we need to do away with it. So, you know, I'm comfortable with that as a basis to get started. The dollar figures that they threw out is a, you know, as a starting point. It was strictly a starting point. I think, and they told us this from the very beginning in their presentations, that they had did it on 2% or 2.5% or something like that, because that was what inflation over the last few years had pretty much averaged, was why they came up with that percentage. But the percentage is going to be whatever we decide to make it. Now, the difference between those levels, you know, as to how much dollars or how many percentages that is also to be determined, yet to be determined. But we've got to have some basis to start with, and to know that this person is in this job classification and this is what they're making now. And then when we do get down to the nitty gritty in the budget time, we can look at what those differences are and maybe what we feel like we need to take them to. And yes, we've already made some adjustments to that with EMS. We're looking at later trying to do something possibly with Sheriff's Department. And there are some of the other departments, you know, facing similar circumstances. But we have to start somewhere. Either we need to do it or we don't need to do it. I mean, the details of how, I think, or when or how much can be worked out in our budget hearings. You know, I don't see us adopting this and doing anything with it. We can adopt it to be effective with the new budget, with July. And then those figures are going to be approved, whatever they are, whether they stay the same or they increase, or how much they increased in the budget hearings, department by department. I mean, it always does, for the biggest part. If somebody's got other thoughts than that, please jump in. Mr. Ferguson, you're right.
One of the things that I believe gives us something we haven't really had before is a structured environment to where we are given a number to consider, not mandated to us, but to consider. And I think that is something we have somewhat lacked in the past, because sometimes people would ask for certain things and in a general time, and you just kind of had to ponder, well, would that be enough? This at least brings something forward in terms of a target number, and then we can, as a commission, decide if that's what's in the best interest, you know, financially to do, or to alter it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Now's the time, if you got questions. Okay. Entertain a motion. Mr. Buckmaster.
Let me reiterate what I said a while ago. I may not have made clear what my intention was. My intention is not to accept the suggestion of moving each employee to the closest step and then moving them up 2.35%. I do not believe that is satisfactory. For some employees, it probably is, but for many, it's just not enough to keep good employees or to hire good employees, which is why my intention was to take that study, look at the average of this particular classification with 5 years of service, average pay is X dollars, and let the department heads put that in their budget. Come to us with that budget, and then we either approve it or don't approve. One of the reasons we're in the shape we are now is because we failed to give cost of living raises. The structure itself, once you get them where they need to be, and then the 2.35% probably still isn't sufficient. And as they've stated many times before, it's not mandatory either. We're not required to give that even if we approve this. Typical cost of living raises I'm seeing in industry is between 3 and 5%. But my personal hope is that we send this to the department heads and say, you propose the competitive rate for each employee in your budget, weighing the wants versus the needs, make it fit. Hopefully we don't have to raise taxes. I'm more than confident that our heads can come up with a budget that will cause us not to raise taxes and still pay a good competitive wage to our employees that will, for lack of a better term, remove the want to work for at least half the counties around us. I don't know whether I explained that like I wanted to, but I don't think it's up to us to say I'm gonna give 2.35% every year from the next 16 years. And I don't think it's up to us to say each employee only deserves 2.35%. Their bosses know what they deserve. And I want them to propose it to me using the figures from the wage study to see what the competitive wage is.
I would like to remind that the department heads were spoken to during the study. They agreed to what the grade levels and steps were assigned to each of their employees. They were not left out of that discussion at all. I think I'm understanding where you're coming from, Mr. Buckmaster. Does that help your thought any at all?
No, my point is we have several employees that are probably 5 steps below where they should be right now. And I've heard the conversation of, let's just move them up 1 step. That's not
Oh,
sufficient.
no. The study would actually move them up to where they should be according to the market study.
Okay, I hadn't heard that. I've heard move them to the next closest step where they are now.
No,
and
no,
move them
no,
up
no.
1 step. If they were below step 1. I'm talking about the guy that's making step 6 that should be making step 11.
There may be some, I don't know, but that was taken into consideration, I think, in what they were proposing and where those particular job classifications landed in the hierarchy of pay positions. So am I correct in saying that, thinking that, Mayor?
Yeah, they they looked at each position, they did the job descriptions, talking to each department head. Once they got the job descriptions, then they compared them to like counties to match them up. And then that's when they came up with the grades and the steps and all that. So it was designed to get them to where they think they need to be. And I don't know if that answered your question or not, but the department heads were heavily involved in it. For example, the only input I had on the grades and steps was from my employees. I didn't determine anything for solid waste or public works. That was done under their department heads and discussions with them.
Mr. Ford?
I think seems to be that most everybody seems to feel like the structure part is okay. From what I'm hearing, then there seems to be judgment as to whether or not the county can do that year after year after year. I feel like the program was looked at very efficiently, and that the people's classifications are now identified properly like they ought to be. Now, where they come up with the amount of money that they put into that for each one of them, I know they considered Wilson and Sumner and some of these other counties. That's the biggest problem I got with it right there. Because we're never going to be able to be in line with our neighboring counties, and ain't nothing we can do about it, and we can't help it. But by the same token, if we're under market in some ways, I think the people deserve it. My biggest question is can we afford to do this year after year? If I remember right, I could be wrong, to inaugurate this program went at $253,000 right off the top. Is that close? That's what I'm thinking it was. 230. We can survive that part of it, but you start adding 2.3, whatever it is, year after year after year. I don't know about that. I know the county's got some big debts ahead of them. And as far as the structure, I don't have a problem with it. But on the other part, I honestly don't know.
Mr. Jewell. Ms. Thomas, you mentioned something there a second ago that it was set that a employee that should be at step 11 would be, that's the way the study was ran. So that it took our employees who was currently employed and said, all right, these employees are sitting at this step now, but they should be at step 11. And that was already figured into that $237,000 roughly. Is that the way I heard you say that? Is that everyone here's understanding? That's the first I had understood that piece of that, just to be honest with you. I had not gathered that in that manner.
What was proposed was after the wage study, they looked at where this employee is, what their job is, what their job duties are. And they compared that to job duties in other jurisdictions and what they make in other jurisdictions. And they did an average or a weighted average on those figures. So if this person pay would put them at level 1. Okay, but their job classification and their job duties would put them at 5. They would enter into this at 5 because that's what their job classifications dictate to equal their pay. That's why you have an increase. If you didn't have those in there, you wouldn't have any increase. You would be setting this thing up with where everybody's at now, and it wouldn't cost you anything.
Of that, I don't disagree, but we talked about setting up averages and comparing our jobs to those others and saying, hey, this job is at this spot, but it never said that it was comparing it to this step of this space, in this case here. That's the first I've seen that. I've read through this thing quite a few times. Did personnel get that out of their committee meetings, that it was saying each person was compared to their position now of where that position would be on the step?
Mr. Ferguson?
That was my understanding as the committee reviewed that I think that was echoed a couple of times. Not everybody was moving at the same level necessarily, but the amount that was presented would get everybody to a catch-up level. Some would move more than others, but then the figure was, okay, guys, if you do this, then it's going to cost this dollar figure. And some would move more than others, and some would have different classifications. That was always my understanding. Now, if someone on the committee
doing that, you wouldn't have a cost figure involved in it. If everybody was staying exactly where they were, there wouldn't be any cost. It'd be everybody's the same.
Mr. Jewell, that's not what I said. I said there was to average us up to get our jobs to be at these places at a comparable rate to our neighbors. I know it said an average of those comparable rates. The 237,000, I think is the number I've got on my mind that it was roughly in that range. That piece was saying that our employees, our current employees, so employees that have been here 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, this job is at this level. Therefore, they are moving, their pay right now is at level 2, but they're going to be getting now paid at level 7 or level 11, whatever their level should be. That study figured that into this $237,000.
That was my understanding. If I'm wrong in that, Mayor, correct me, Amy, correct me, Bill, correct me. That was my understanding. I mean, I don't know how you would have a dollar figure if you weren't doing that, but maybe I'm looking at it wrong. Mayor?
And you'll have to forgive me, I meant to bring the scale and everything with me, and I think it's sitting on my desk, but if I remember correctly, if you look at the proposed increases for the employees, they took the market median for that position. And they took what their current pay is, and they suggested an immediate increase if you wanted to do that, and then a general increase. So there was 2 steps. They got an increase for each step. So the number that they gave them at the end of that general increase, you would compare that to the scale, and they would be whatever position, whether it's step 6 or 7, that would put them that dollar amount per hour would set them where they're out on the scale.
I believe in addition to that though, Mayor, the time that they had been on the job got some consideration too.
Well, that was figured into the dollar amount. Like I said, the position, I'll give you an example. Here's one that was paying $14.96. Let me see if I can find it again. $14.96 currently. Well, that's what it was at the time. The market median was $16.77. When you went to the 2 increases, the first step increase was $15.09, then up to $15.45, which put them making 92.1% of the market median. And again, their pay already is kind of based on their experience and everything. And then that put them each depending on your skill and training and everything required, that puts you on a grade. And then on the grade, you've got the steps, and that could be falling in line with your experience and whatnot, your seniority. So like I said, if you had Bob and Bob's on grade 4, Bob has been given a specific increase on this. So you could have 2 people on the same grade that are on different steps. Bob's stepping him up with what this is could get him to be step 6, 7, whatever it is that falls on that pay scale. Whereas Ted, if Ted's only been there a year, he's on a lower step than Bob would be. And that was built into the suggested raises. At least that's how I understood it.
It's a matrix, not just up, but it's over. And the over depends on years of service and whether they meet certain criteria and they're approved for it. But the baseline starting pay is the starting pay in that job classification. Currently, when they did the study, averaging the 10 jurisdictions that they looked at. They looked at small ones the same size as ours, and they looked at our neighboring ones. Whether we want to be in competition with our neighbors or not, we are in competition with our neighbors, particularly for jobs. I mean, and particularly because we're so slow. Small. There's one thing, we're slow too. One thing that, a large county that you got to drive 30 minutes to get to the next city of the next county is different from us having to drive 15 minutes to be in the next big city. So you have to factor that in because it's the reality of what we're dealing with. Whether we can, that's another discussion. Whether we should, that's another discussion. But that's the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it's become more apparent in the last few months than it ever was a year ago when we were trying to put this thing together. And, whatever y'all want to do. I mean, we do not have to do this. We do not have to adopt it, but we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to look at each individual department and each, one way or the other, whether we adopt it or don't, because we need to refresh these numbers. So I don't think even if we adopt it with what was put forward as a outline or a guidance, would negate us from doing the other. I think, as long as we put that into the language of the adopting documents, that we're going to look at it every year, subject to funding, available funding. It's a simple statement that has large ramifications. And I think it solves a lot of the concerns that a lot of us, myself included, have had with this whole process. And, but y'all tell me what you want to tell me. Mr. Ferguson.
To a degree, a couple of years ago, we did something at a much smaller scale with one of the departments, and it was in the sheriff's department. Maybe not to this magnitude, but we had step scale raises in the past, and you guys have had that since then. Yes. We had more structure than what we had before. Now, I'm not saying that this works or doesn't work. I think some of those people never got to that scale. And again, we may have to adjust things as we go forward, but it has been done in a limited basis before. It's not our first time down the path.
The thing with my people on the scale that we were doing, you know, you started out at a amount, you went through the academy, you went to another rate. Then after 2 years, you went to a rate. And after 5, you got a raise. The trouble I'm having, nobody ever makes it to 5. Most of them quit at about 2 and go somewhere else. I had an individual stop me 2 weeks ago and asked me about working for me. He worked here years ago for Sheriff Robinson and me too. And I told him what we paid. And he said, I can't work for that. Wilson County called me today, doing a record check on him, a reference check, and they're going to hire him over Wilson County. That's just the problem I'm having. Somebody with experience that was a good employee for Travis County years ago was wanting to come back, and he can't afford to.
So Mr. Chairman, I'm going to take this bull by the horns. We kicked this can down the road long enough. We've discussed it backwards, forwards, and sideways. And I am a proponent that the structure is solid and sound. And I'm not talking about the dollar figure that's associated with it. I think we can separate those two, but I'm going to make a motion tonight that we move this before the entire body to discuss further, but to accept the step raises structure as it was presented in our study. That's a motion.
Second.
Do have that as a motion. Do I have a second? Ms. Jones, I believe. I'm sorry, looking the wrong way. Ms. Jones has a second. All right. Any further discussion on this? Are you clear on the motion? Would you read back the motion, please?
Motion to recommend the step increase structure to the full body.
With no dollar amount, because again, this thing can move and we can have that second discussion and we can decide something about that separately. It's just the structure itself that gets us at least something to look at from year to year.
Okay, any further discussion? Seeing none, ready to vote on this? Can we do this by show of hands, please? All in favor, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I don't know whether I counted me. Did I count me? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. All opposed? Motion does carry. Any abstentions? Okay. We'll move this on to next Monday night. No. Yes. Work session. Yes, we can take it up further in work session. Okay. I guess at this point, the thing that we need to be looking at is these dollar amounts, whether we want to go with what was recommended as a starting point going into budget. So they have some figures to do budget with, and then adjust them through the budget hearings, which we're typically going to have to do. But they either have to have the starting point of what was recommended or what is current. Am I correct in saying that, Mayor? Amy?
Yes, sir. We'll have to have some kind of reference as to how the budget going forward. And I see Amy looks like she's got something to say, so I'll turn it over to her. She might be. Am I correct in that?
I mean, basically, yes, the next decision, which does not have to be done tonight, the next decision I would like to see is the numbers that have been presented to you. Do you want to keep those numbers, or do you want to increase the percentage that those numbers are based on? Does that make sense?
Everybody understand that? Would you state that again? Slowly, for old people that don't hear well, like myself.
I will try. So the next decision that I need made, currently the cost of living, cost of labor, whichever acronym you want to use, is at 2.5 in the numbers that were given to you in the compensation study. I need to know if you would like to keep that 2.5 currently, or if you would like to adjust the scale as it was given to you by another percentage. Mainly because those numbers are, as we all know, outdated by a year, at least.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I could, and Amy, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. Basically, you're asking is, do you want, like, let's say, I think Social Security did a 5.9% cost of living adjustment in December. Do you want to keep it at the 2.5 that was already built in, or do you want to adjust them up for that? I know Mr. Brunt Thompson said cost of living or cost of labor, but whatever. Would you like to see the numbers that was presented to you, but add 5% to all of them? Or what percentage would you like to do? I think that's what Amy's question is.
What numbers do we want to see projected in our budget projections to go into budget hearings with? Do we want just what it is now? Do we want what would be projected at the 2.5? Do we want to look at what 10% is, or, you know, what percentage does she need to apply to the existing figures for next year's budget? You know we've already addressed this somewhat with EMS. Those figures have been changed already. And so I think that's not a question that we have to answer tonight. That is a question that she's going to have to answer before she can give us, or we're going to have to answer to her for her to prepare numbers for us to look at budget numbers, proposed budget numbers. Mr. Buckmaster?
I'd like to see what the figures look like. If every employee's below the average was moved to the average, and then every employee with a 2.5, maybe a 3.5 and a 5%, and just see where those go. Would that be extremely difficult?
It would take some time for me to sit down and look at it to see if I can, how difficult it would be.
I think in fairness, we need to try to take the existing numbers and maybe the total dollar numbers. Would that work if we had what our total payroll is and look at what that total payroll would go to at 2.5 or 3 or 5 or whatnot for this coming year, so that we look at total dollars before we look at individual departments possibly.
I thought that's what we're doing with this program, is getting all these classifications and putting them to where they feel like was a comfortable figure. Now, what percentage it is, I don't know. If it's 2.5, it's 2.5. And you sat there a while ago and said some of them would get considerably more than others. So
that's in the implementation of
right in the implementation.
But as far as increases
for the next
year, yes, for the increases for the next year.
Well, there many of them is going to get a great increase anyway, so I think you should go with the 2.5.
Ms. Jones?
Well, I personally feel that those numbers are already outdated, and with the current economic climate that we have facing the country today, they're going to be sorely beneath what they need to be.
I think that's a very valid point. 2.5 a year ago, probably what we needed to be looking at, with inflation doing who knows what. 9 at last figures. 2.5 is, I hate to use the term insult, but it's almost an insult to think somebody's going to stay with us and be happy in their job getting a 2.5% increase in today's job climate. It's just not going to happen.
No
some of
The
them.
stimulus,
Right.
bonus too.
The stimulus monies, that bonus took care of the immediate need.
That's it.
And that was for their service that they performed during COVID in times past. It wasn't meant to be a carrot to keep them here now. That was a bit of a reward for sticking with us through all this madness. At least in my mind. Maybe I'm looking at it wrong, but that's kind of, I thought, the reason we were doing that, and that was the rationale for it. But if I overspoke by saying that, I'm sorry. But I think we need to. I don't want her to have to figure 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4. I mean, we can make it 2.5 and 5 and 10 or something big gap so that there's enough difference in there for us to know what the difference would be. Certainly. Will there be some departments that tend to have maybe more increases? Possibly. That gets into there again, a question of fairness. I can't answer. That's something we all have to decide and live with our conscience on. But I don't think, if I polled you right now and asked you to raise your hand, if you thought we didn't need to do anything, I don't think I'd have a hand go up. I think everyone here realizes that we're going to have to do something. And all she's asking for is a preliminary figure to base her figures that she gives to us as a starting point. They can go up, they can go down, they can stay the same, but she needs some figure to start that off with. Ms. Jones?
Could I make a recommendation of 7.5%? Make a motion for that to be figured?
7.5 only or multiple?
What do you mean by multiple? It's 2.5 already, basically, and then add another 5% on it for 7.5.
That's a big chunk, but I think in our wildest imagination, that's the most that I could even begin to see us trying to do. But
Well, I mean, if you're going to do it, you need to do it right to keep the people here, to keep them from traveling out. And I mean, if you want to pay for this quality services, you're going to have to pay a quality price. And I mean, and it might, who knows, it could be pictured as a tax increase. I don't know, but I'm just saying, if we want to retain and recruit quality people, we're going to have to pay.
I know that sounds like a big jump, but I know a lot of counties have implemented 10% across the board already, not even going into their next budget season. I don't think that's beyond the stretch. I really don't. I think that would be the problems when we do throw out a figure that way. There are people that are going to get in their mind that's what they're getting when we're just sitting here talking about it. And that's something that I think we need to also keep that in mind. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you said, figure up 2 or 3 different levels. Maybe it'd be 5%, 7.5%.
That was more what I was looking at. If we knew not little jumps, but a substantial 2.5, 5, and 7.5 possibly. That way you've got 3 choices. When you're working them up, you've got it in front of it. You're just going to hit that multiplier on each one. As long as, she knows what to do. I think would that be that difficult to do it that way? Mayor, are you on board with doing that possibly?
Yeah, I think that if you do it that way, that'll give you, like you said, 7.5%, that's going to be a sizable jump. And that'll give you a good idea. Okay, if you go this far in, here's the total increase you're looking at as far as your budget year over year. No, I think that's a good idea. That way you can see the 2.5, So you've got your bottom range at 2.5, you got your middle at 5, and you got your high end at 7.5, and that give you a good broad spectrum to look at.
Mr. Clary, do you recognize?
Oh, why don't we forget the 2.5 and start with 4? I mean, Mr. Chambers said a while ago that the Social Security went up 5.9%. That ended up with me $16 a week. So you can,
To be fair, we're probably going to need to fall in somewhere in that roughly 6%. Now, whether it's factored in what you've already done is a part of that. And that would just be to reflect what it was last year. That's just to get people back to ground zero. That's really all it's doing. I do know that we're trying to get some figures on where we're going to be with the penny value. And it looks like we're looking at about a 30% roughly growth rate on appraisals, on total appraisals. So, you know, it's going to be a complicated year trying to put all this together because of all of the factors that are just so out of the norm from what we've been having to deal with. So it is going to take a lot of searching, but you know, whether the bottom is 2.5 or 4, I don't think you're going to wind up at the bottom. So probably, you have any thoughts on that, Mayor?
No, I'd agree with you. I was just, you know, going off what you said, that'll give you the idea of the spectrum. But if you want to make the bottom 4, well, then you can do that. But I just think you got that wide range of look at, okay, here's what these initial middle points are, these initial options are, and then you can say, like, if you look at 4% and well, what if it's 6%, you know? But then again, that'll give you a good basis to start your discussions off of. It's not, I'm not going to say that's the final. I'm just saying that's the starting point to begin your discussions.
We do have a motion on the floor from Ms. Jones to, was it to do 7.5 or to do multiple?
I think to do the, say, 2.5 or 4%, as you say, 4%, 5.5% and 7.5%, or 5% and 7.5%. But I definitely want 7.5 to be looked at if possible. Yeah, yeah, 2, 5, 7.5. Yeah, yeah, 2, 5, 7.5.
So your motion is to put the figures together for
2.5,
2.5, 5,
and 7.5.
and 7.5. And that was, Mr. Walsh has a second to that. Okay, any further discussion on this? Okay, will all in favor of putting that together that way, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Any opposed? Okay, does carry. That give you the direction that you need to move forward. Okay, thank you. Okay. Does that take care of everything that we needed to do at this point on the compensation study implementation, Mayor?
Yeah, I believe that should be it.
Okay, thank you. All right, next item we have is to look at an immediate, I assume, increase on Sheriff Department employees. Sheriff, tell us what you need.
We talked about it back a few weeks ago. When we were talking that night, I kind of misunderstood what everybody was saying. I thought you was talking about taking $1 for the whole pay study. And, you know, I knew that wouldn't work, but what I came up with is $2 an hour for every employee I've got. And what I will do is take that $2 away from the pay study whenever I work up my budget for this year. Take that amount away from it. And a lot of them are still, you know, underpaid. Just get this $2 comparable to what the pay study says.
Questions, commissioners? Mayor, are you in concurrence on this? Do you understand what he's asking for, what he's planning to do? I'm not real sure.
I believe what he's saying, if you went ahead and did your immediate increase of $2 across the board now, when you're looking at these adjustments, if, let's say, you had Ted, who instead of getting $2 an hour would have got, I guess, $1.50, when you do your increase later, he's only going to get the 50-cent difference. I don't think I'm saying that correctly. Let's say if you went ahead and did $2 now and their rate later would have been the $2, and then you don't change them, but you would adjust the other ones, whether they're lower, you would adjust them.
Yeah.
That would come off. Like if their rate was if their increase would have been $2.50, after you do your $2 and then you do your increase later, they only get the 50-cent difference. They don't get another $2.50 on top of
Yeah,
that.
that's correct. I got some that's $3.50 an hour short. And we'll just subtract the $2 from the $3.50, then I'll look at the other $1.50 in the pay study they would get later.
Okay. So we're talking about basically $2 across the board increase for all your personnel. And that amount would be subtracted from whatever the increase in next year's budget would be.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you, Mayor, Amy, y'all work with these figures a lot more than me. Is there any employees, if that percentage wound up at 2.5%, would not receive at least a $2 increase? Are you catching my drift? You can't take $2 away from somebody you're only giving $1.50 to, like the mayor started out saying. So that's my concern. Certainly if they're going to get that much of an increase, at least that much of an increase, I could see where this is possible. My other question on this, and I'm sorry, I didn't know that twist was going to be on this. Is there anything wage and any legalities to being able to do this or to do this way, where you're actually giving something to somebody, but in some respects you're taking it away from them. You're not taking it away from them. You're basically, I guess, giving it to them in advance. I think there's anything in wage and hour laws that would
I believe
address this.
legally we'll have to do a new salary agreement, because the salary agreement you have signed, thank you, Mr. Beller, says that we cannot increase what you have already agreed to. So if this goes through, we'll have to do another agreement, because it goes against what you've already signed.
I know that you're dealing with some difficult times now, Sheriff, and please don't take my words wrong. I realize that. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But I also realize that we're starting budget. We're 3 months away from putting together a new budget and new figures across the board that we're talking about doing here. You think you can hold out till then? If I'm just asking.
Y'all asked me 2 weeks ago, a month ago, what I needed. I didn't ask y'all, and I just gave y'all this number. And it's up to y'all whether you do it or not. I've signed my agreement for this year, and I had to sign an agreement yesterday for the bonuses. It's up to y'all what y'all want to do. Y'all asked me, and this is what I'm telling you I need. I would like to have, if y'all going to give it to me, the employees would appreciate it. I would appreciate it, but it's really up to y'all.
I think some of the concerns is this is there again coming right on the heels of a substantial bonus, and there again not going to everyone, all departments. And I think there's some department heads that feel they have just as much need for increases as necessarily you do. And I'm not diminishing the importance of one versus the other. I'm not want to get into that discussion. I'm just saying, at least in my mind, I want to be fair to everyone. I want to be fair to you. I want to be fair to your people, but I want to be fair to everyone. So that was the main reason I asked the question, the way I asked it. Not opposed, not taking a stand one way or the other, just ask the question. Mr. Buckmaster, did you want to be recognized?
I did, but looked like Mr. Gully had his mic lit first. If he wants to go first, otherwise I will. I've taken upon myself to speak to probably 80% of the employees at the Sheriff's Department in the last 2 weeks. Full transparency, my daughter's one of them. The general consensus is something over 50% of them are unhappy with the pay. Surprisingly, a large majority of them are unhappy with the benefits. It's about 50-50. What I can tell you is, without naming names, there are a lot of them hanging on by a thread. As I said last time we met, they're waiting to see what we do to see if they're going to stay. And I mean that in all seriousness. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just telling you, these people are ready to go because every other department has given substantial raises in the last 3 to 5 months. And they can make a lot more money even paying gas to go to the surrounding communities. We've seen that, which is why I'd like to do this. The $2 an hour is fine with me. Many of the other departments, the surrounding counties haven't seen this large increase middle of the budget. Emergency Services has. With that, I'd like to make a motion that we accept Sheriff Russell's recommendation for $2 across the board increase effective next pay period, if possible.
For that, thank you for that motion. I think Mr. Gully was next in line.
Yes, I did have a question here too, if that's all right. From what I see presented to me here in this case, we're looking at about $56,467.08 is what's being projected. That's what you've got in yellow here highlighted. Am I reading that correctly? The 2 yellow highlights together for the next 6 payments. Did I read that correctly? The back page shows another $6,897.08.
One's for 101, the other's for 111.
Total
Yeah, that's
money.
correct.
So
Total money.
You're correct.
$56,467.08. All right, from there, that says for 6 payments, correct? We pay 24 payments in a year, correct? 26. All right. Every 2 weeks, correct? They're off of 2 weeks there. Forgot 2 of them, I guess. So as we're looking, there we go. As we look here in this case, that's 20 additional. If we're looking at that in 6 payments, we divide that piece out. I'm just trying to look at a total cost here. We're looking at roughly in the next year's budget for this one department of about $250,000.
I do have those annual amounts in boxes down at the bottom.
Say again.
I have those annual amounts down in boxes on the bottom of those sheets.
You know, it would have been nice if I'd have read down below the highlighted area. You're exactly right.
I'm sure your students appreciate that statement, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay.
In saying that, that's $29,512 and $214,806. The only thing I mentioned here, we really need to know some numbers about what we're going to have in our budgets before we get going too far here. I don't disagree with the motion and where we are. We're talking about a large dollar amount. What was the dollar amount for the EMS? EMS is not on here.
That is 32,690 for Fund 118.
Is that for the year?
That is just for the remainder of this year.
That's what I'm asking. What's the next year's budget? Because that's still in next year's budget.
That number I do not have in front of me.
Can we get that? How many payments that was over? We can divide it out real quick and get a pretty good idea.
I believe that was based on 9 pay periods.
Ms. Atwood, did you want to?
I have also, just like Mr. Buckmaster, I've spoke with a few of them, and I think this would help with them to stay. I do feel like that this is, yes, I do want to second the motion.
We do have a motion and a second to go forward to the full body with sheriff's recommendation of $2 an hour for all positions across the board. In that amount to be taken into consideration in next year's budget figure increases. Is that correct on your motion? Okay. All right, Mr. Walsh.
Is that taking into account that he'll sign a new agreement also to make that legal?
He's going to have to do that.
Can we add that to the motion?
I think that has to be done. I don't know whether it needs to necessarily be in the motion because
I'm good with adding it. I'm sure
Yeah.
Mr. Buckmaster probably is too.
I think since we haven't voted on it, we can restate the motion to include that. The motion was made with that by them. So we'll include that in the motion. If we had already voted on it, we would have to amend it, but since it's not been voted on, we don't have to amend it. They can restate their motion to include that. Okay. Any other thoughts on this before we vote on it? Mr. Ford, I think your hand went up first. Okay. We will before we vote on it. Ms. Jones, we're in discussion.
I've had my light on for a long time.
I couldn't see it for a shoulder here.
First off, I want to say you can't hold the bonuses against them because that was just bonus. That doesn't have anything to do with their
Right.
pay.
I understand.
So that should not be even in consideration. I do think they need the $2
Okay.
immediate because like I said, if you
No, I
want to
think that-
retain and recruit, you have to pay for the service.
Okay. Would you read the motion as you have it recorded, please, ma'am?
Motion to accept the sheriff's immediate increase effective April 7th of 2022 with amended salary agreement signed by the sheriff.
I believe, Mr. Buckmaster, you made the motion as far as reflecting or taking into consideration this $2 increase toward next year's budget appropriations. How would you like that stated, sir?
Motion to accept the sheriff's proposal of $2 per hour immediate increase per employee, which would reflect on the pay study at budget time and including a new pay agreement, payroll agreement. Did I get it all?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Just want to make sure that we have it recorded correctly and we know what we're voting on. Words are important. Okay. Any further discussion?
Got one.
Mr. Walsh.
April 7th, is that a date for the next pay period or what's that date? Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's just do this one with a voice vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That's what I thought. Motion does carry. We'll move this to the full body. Yes, sir. Okay, abstain. Were there any other abstentions? Mr. Ford, you abstained. Mr. Clarity abstained. So that would put it 9 in favor, 2 abstentions. Okay. Any further comments on this?
Mr. Jewell,
Mayor, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. I'm
should I
sorry.
abstain with cause because of because of my employment?
You're really not voting on the amount at this point in time. When we do vote on it in the actual implementation, yes, you will need to.
Thank you.
You could, if you wanted to. It probably wouldn't have been a bad idea to, but as far as have to, I don't think you would have to. All right, do we have any other business to come before us tonight? Mayor, anything else that you want to introduce to us tonight before next Monday?
No, sir.
Amy, did we cover everything that you needed? Okay. Public comments? Anybody in the public like to make a comment? Okay. Yes. Yes, Sheriff.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank y'all, and I know the employees will thank you too. It means a lot to them.
Our regular budget meeting next Monday night at 6 o'clock. We do have several budget amendments and a few things to go over. I hope we can get it all in that 1 hour before our work session and not have to go into our work session time, but I think we can. If we need to, we will. Please look over your packet, look over those things, and if you have questions, try to get them answered between now and then and not necessarily bring them up in that meeting. It would probably expedite the meeting a bit. And I know I've been accused of worrying more about the time than what we do, but I think that's also a part of the job, is to try to keep us on track and as concise as we can. Mr. Walsh, you recognize.
Motion to adjourn.
We have a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second? Ms. Jones makes second. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? You just stay here all night.